What is the science of reading? What are leaders doing to accelerate reading achievement? We answer these questions and more in Science of Reading Leadership, Guiding Minds, Transforming Lives, powered by Just Right Reader.
We are thrilled today to have Dr. Laura Tortorelli with us here on the podcast. Laura is an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. Her scholarship focuses on who teachers teach and how they teach children to read, with a focus on bridging the divides between research and practice. Drawing on developmental perspectives and critical quantitative inquiry, her research investigates the tests, text, and technology that shape reading instruction in elementary classrooms and the impact of these tools on readers who have been labeled as struggling. Tortorelli has been awarded multiple awards and been published in a variety of reading journals. She is actively involved in statewide literacy initiatives in Michigan, including training state literacy coaches on the literacy essentials and collaborating with Write to develop online modules on phonological awareness and letter-sound relationships. Dr. Tortorelli, welcome. We are thrilled and so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, we are so excited. So this is the first question I really want to know. I always want to ask this question to all of the researchers and people that we get to talk to. What is it that got you into the field of education?
Oh, okay. Well, I loved reading when I grew up. That was my favorite thing to do. I was the kid who got in trouble for reading during math and social studies time, with that. I had like a little Nancy Drew book at my desk. And so I thought for a long time that meant that I should be a writer, that I should write my own books. And so I studied creative writing in high school and college. And I even went to graduate school to get an MFA in creative writing for a while. And so while I was doing that, though, it turns out that I needed a side job. And so I started teaching creative writing classes to young kids in after school programs all over New York City, actually. I was like taking the subway around to different schools in Queens and teaching kids to write poetry. And I realized that to write, they really needed to spend a lot of time reading, right? And that they needed to have, and they loved it. They absolutely loved writing their own poetry, but they also needed like to be able to engage with that text. They needed the models of all the different types of things. And I just realized that I didn't want to create my own books. I wanted to work with kids and supporting them and teaching them how to access all the literature that had been so meaningful to me. So it was sort of it wasn't a last minute shift. I was working with kids and I did, study education in undergrad as well. But I'd always thought I would teach writing, and I realized that teaching reading is really fundamental. And so I went back and got my degree in teaching reading because I realized that was what I wanted to do.
I love that.
I had no idea. We've gotten to talk with Dr. Tortorelli quite a bit, and I did not know that story. I love that.
Yeah.
Isn't that great? Yeah.
So, Laura, one of the reasons we love chatting with you is because you really have this expertise in kind of the intermediate grades. We talk a lot when we talk about the science of reading with pre-K through second, a lot of the foundational grades, and we'd love just to talk to you more about that 3rd through 5th. Mm-hmm. And so, what should be happening in 3rd through 5th grade classrooms as far as good reading instruction goes?
Yeah. So I also, started out looking at, what's happening in kindergarten and first grade, and was very interested in that. But I think that the science of reading, discussion sometimes minimizes what needs to happen after that. I think we often talk about is if we just get everything right in kindergarten and first grade, then it's going to be taken care of and they're going to be good for the rest of their reading careers. But that's not actually what we see. What we see is that texts that children need to read in each grade level increase in difficulty quite a bit from grade level to grade level. So they need continuous support and instruction. It's not just about that light bulb moment where they figure out the letters, make the sounds and the words, although that's incredibly important. But they actually need continued practice and support in developing their reading skills throughout the elementary grades. And I mean, I would argue beyond too, although that's not my area of expertise. And so that includes teaching kids to read multisyllabic words, not just, multisyllabic words are more complicated. They draw on the same phonics skills they've been learning, but they involve more complicated things like stress patterns and schwas and that kind of thing. But also supporting kids in reading more complex syntax, right? And more complex structured texts. And particularly providing a lot of those supports around informational text is what my research has been focused on the past few years.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. That's great. Now, with that same thought in mind, I know that you've done a lot of research concerning reading fluency, right? And when we think about informational text and reread and doing it again and making sure we understand all of the nuances that are a part of informational text, what should we be doing as it relates to fluency? Mm-hmm. What should districts be focusing on as it relates to fluency? And really, what can we do to improve fluency if that's something you found is important?
Absolutely. That's another thing I would, that once children do develop those phonics skills, they need lots and lots of practice reading texts to develop their reading fluency. And that's a big transition that happens ideally in first and second grade so that they come into third grade, feel it with pretty fluent reading skills. But if they don't, that's a major area of focus. And so my research really focused on how kids need additional support for reading fluency in informational text. So, and so what I would say is that when I started this line of research, my concern was that fluency was being taught as sort of a separate part of a separate part of the curriculum, right? You had your fluency passages and you would read the same passage multiple times and try to get faster. And then sometimes kids were going home with stopwatches and everything. And so that's okay. Like repeated reading is a research-based instructional technique. I would say that what we want is kids to read and reread a wide range of texts, not just like the prepackaged fluency passages. And we also want them to be reading for meaning. Right. So the recent IES practice guide that focused on interventions for 4th through 8th grade really highlights that repeated readings should have a purpose for each reading. Right. The first time you're reading, you might be trying to, just reading to get the gist. The second time you might identify main ideas and details. The third time you might be reading to plan a response, right? To write or something like that. But that there's a reason to reread. And in fact, as an adult reader, we do that, right? If we want to we go back and reread something because we aren't sure, we want to clarify, we enjoyed it, we're going to use it, we're going to cite it in something we're reading. So giving them lots of opportunities to develop fluency in different types of texts, and then purposeful rereading, not just rereading to read faster each time.
And I know that Christy's going to jump in and say this, but I love the point you were just making, because situational fluency, I think also we need to be considering the fact that sometimes you will read a narrative text quite quickly and your, fluency number might be high, right? But when we're reading informational text, the fluency number might be slower, and helping them to understand that the okayness of that.
Yeah, that's actually
really
one of my
important.
First research studies that I did when I was building towards my dissertation, was looking at how quickly a large database, statewide database of students read informational text, and it was slower than the published benchmarks for what typically are narrative or mixed texts, but the comprehension level was the same. And in fact, the kids who were the strongest readers slowed down the most relative to those benchmarks, indicating that they're paying attention to the text features and slowing down and processing the new information, which is actually a good thing and what we want them to be doing.
Sorry, my mind is kind of reeling now. So when we think about fluency, because I think this maybe is a misunderstood area sometimes when we talk about all of the prongs of literacy. And so when you think about the proper way to teach fluency and the proper measures to even be gleaning from fluency assessments, what do you think needs to change in either teacher preparation or district PD for teachers so that they are looking at fluency correctly and teaching fluency correctly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so one of the things, I work in teacher preparation. I work in a very highly ranked large teacher prep program. And so this is something that I've been thinking about. And so one of the things that I think is really important is that we think about the different types of fluency supports and make sure that teachers are familiar with all of them, right? It's not just having kids reread a text to themselves that builds fluency, but there's also, there's modeling is part of fluency, modeling a fluent reading of the text. There is echo reading, choral reading, partner reading, whisper reading. That's a continuum of support. And so you can have kids working on a fluency text with different levels of support, either on different days or differentiated by what they need. And so really thinking about how that fluency support exists to help kids access texts that might be too difficult for them to read on their own. I think there's this idea that they need to just go off and read them by themselves and then reread by themselves and then reread. But like, in fact, kids need support, to build that fluency. So really making sure that that teachers have like this tool belt of fluency strategies, not just one, I think is a big part of that. And then the other part is, making sure that, that kids get support and feedback during their fluent. We don't want them to just reread the text by themselves, right? We want them to, if they come to a word they don't know, slow down and figure it out, and get support for doing that, and not just like blast through the words and make their best guess.
Would you say then too, with that range of tools for fluency, is that also if you were doing a choral reading and then you were doing a whisper reading, you should have different purposes for those too? The purpose is not just to reread. Within those, you are still using that new purpose. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. You might have a purpose for reading the text, and also choose a level of support for those students at that time for that reading.
Excellent.
That's really good. So I want to stay here just a little bit longer because I want to know how we choose the text that we put in front of our students, right? How do we make those wise, intentional decisions about the text?
Well, and so that's a really great question because, again, there are programs that have picked fluency passages, but we want to make sure that they develop fluency in a range of texts. And so what I would say is the ideal text for fluency practice would be one that's a little bit challenging, right? It's not too easy. You don't want it to be something where they are stuck on every word. But if you're going to be there to provide that fluency support, then reading something that's challenging with that support is actually an opportunity for growth. So you want a mix of narrative and informational texts. And you also want to make sure that there are new words that they're encountering and there are new text structures that they're encountering in those pieces that they're reading with your support, because that's an opportunity to read something that they wouldn't necessarily go off and read independently. And grappling with that more difficult text is part of how they grow. Also, when I was teaching, I love to do poetry for fluency because it just naturally supports that expression and prosody, which is something that we often leave out when we think about developing reading fluency. So the poetry, there were a lot of like very funny Shel Silverstein poems and things like that, some of which are quite long, that I used to use with my classes to help build their reading fluency because it was fun to reread them. They were funny, right? And then also that really provided them with support for thinking about like the rhythm and intonation of the text.
This was eye-opening for me. I feel like we haven't talked enough about fluency. And I especially love the focus on 3rd through 5th because, again, we have that focus so often on the early elementary grades, which we know are obviously important, but I love being able to focus on intermediate.
This episode is brought to you by Just Right Reader. Extend phonics instruction, strengthen school-home partnerships, and accelerate reading achievement with take-home decodable packs from Just Right Reader. Personalized take-home packs make phonics fun and accessible for families. Every book comes with a video phonics lesson and writing pages to help readers reinforce their decoding and writing skills. To learn more, visit justrightreader.com. You mentioned and talked about every time we have a purpose. And one of the purposes that I heard you leading into is now we're going to use this to cite, or we're going to use this to go into something. So can you talk to us about the purpose of even reading and now taking that into writing? What do you want to understand about writing? Is it important to teach along with reading? What should they be doing, leaders, to ensure that good quality writing instruction is happening in our buildings? Talk to us a little bit about the whole
Yeah,
writing.
well, so there's a couple of different things that we need to think about when we're thinking about writing instruction. Obviously, writing for itself is really important, and we want to give kids opportunities to write every day and make sure that they are writing every day and developing those writing skills. And we want to give them explicit instruction in teaching in writing different genres. But something that something that I think is overlooked sometimes is that writing is also a comprehension strategy. Having children, there's a lot of research evidence that having children write in response to things they read solidifies their understanding of the text and helps them learn information from that text. There's tons and tons of meta-analyses on this. And so writing is important in its own right. In my work, I tend to think of it as a comprehension supporting strategy, though, because there is so much evidence for those for that. And writing and reading really support each other. And so when they are done together, you have a lot of benefits because you get a mentor text, right? They've just read something that shows you an example of what this kind of text looks, and writing in response to it, either writing an opinion about what you just read, or writing an alternative ending to a story, or writing your own informational passage, like pulling on the new facts you've learned. Any sort of thing like that helps you understand the text better and also helps you advance your writing skills. So doing those two things together is actually really important. And I just published a study this year with my colleague Adria Truckenmiller that looked at how children write in response to reading. And basically what we found was that if you don't their reading fluency of the passages really impacts how well they are able to respond in writing, right? Which makes sense, right? If you aren't able to read a passage and have a really good, thoughtful engagement with that passage, writing in response to it is going to be fairly weak. And so really strengthening those two systems together is something that can help kids in the 3rd through 5th grade strengthen the whole communicative system. And oftentimes there are a lot, we tell kids to write. We say we're teaching kids to write, but we're really just telling them to write. And so writing in response to reading is a way to structure that and give them a little bit more support.
Laura, are there any types of constructed responses? I know you mentioned kind of opinion or alternative endings. Are there any types of writing prompts that support struggling readers especially, or is it kind of the same across the board?
So there are basically giving children time to plan and an organized structure for planning is what's most helpful for people who are struggling writers. For example, the TIDE organizer, and now I'm going to forget what it stands for. It's topic, ideas, details, and ending. And then there's one that's called RACE. Yeah. That's good too. I can't remember what it stands for now.
Restate the question, answer the question,
right.
Cite evidence, and explain.
Exactly. So giving them opportunities to plan out what they're going to write is a really good way to support them, because oftentimes they get kind of overwhelmed when they're staring at the blank page and they don't know what to do. And so taking a minute to plan out what you're going to write is very helpful. Sometimes using a graphic organizer to do that planning can be helpful. And then also for kids who are a little bit younger or who are really struggling to get started, sentence frames are something that I always recommend. Is that if you using those to direct them and have them focus in on the content that you want them to write, rather than trying to figure out how to start the sentence, are things that can offer more support.
Those are great scaffolding ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you about that sentence frame. I've seen a lot of younger classroom teachers who are doing that in their classroom to kind of give that framework for what paragraphs look like. And I want to get your feedback on how you feel like that would impact struggling writers who are in grades 3 through 5, right? Is that a good strategy, or is that still too much scaffolding and should be left in the lower grades? What are your
So
thoughts
it
on that?
really depends on your goal for that writing. If your goal is to help them work on sentence construction, then the sentence frames kind of provide too much support. But I'm working with a doc student right now who's trying to get students to write about their social, about the emotion vocabulary, right? They're having, really get at their emotional response to the text. And so she's using sentence frames even in 5th grade so that she's directing them to talk about the things that she wants to talk, so that she's taking the pressure off of them, to figure out how to say what she's asking. And they can just focus on the content, which is their emotional response to the story. So I think it really depends on the goal of your lesson. If the goal is to, kind of get them to express themselves without a lot of pressure, then those sentence frames can be helpful. They can be, and you can just include them as optional. For students who don't want to use them, that's fine. But if your goal is to really help them, construct a good sentence, then of course you'll want to take that away and actually just walk them through that process.
Laura, what about vocabulary for our intermediate students? Have you either done any research on vocabulary, or obviously I'm sure you're aware of vocabulary? Tell us about the importance of that in the intermediate classroom.
Actually, so this is one of the things that I think is most fascinating about this intermediate grades, the intermediate grades, because what's happening is when kids are first learning to read, they are encountering words and texts that they already know in their oral language. They just haven't seen them in print before. So the task in front of them is just to figure out how to decode that word and match it to a word that they already know. Usually, there's some exceptions, but usually that's what's happening. And so reading really is a decoding task in those early grades, because they're reading books that are not, do not have very familiar vocabulary, do not have big, long words in them, do not have unfamiliar words in them. And so they are learning how to decipher those words. Around 3rd grade, things really change because they're going to be reading more and more texts that introduce brand new vocabulary. And we're actually starting to expect them to learn new vocabulary from the reading. And so that's a big shift. And they're not just able to when we think about the multisyllabic decoding piece, you want to teach them how to decode the word and match it to a word that they know. And one of the steps is figuring out if it sounds right. But then they might not know it, right? It still might be a brand new word that they haven't seen before. And actually, a lot of these words, are words that are related to words that they know, but are derived forms, which means that you've added suffixes that change its part of speech, into a whole different word. So, for example, the word adore and the word adorable are two different parts of speech, right? You've taken a verb and turned it into an adjective. And so they actually have to pay attention to all the word parts. If you've ever listened to a kid this age read, who is not paying close attention, you'll notice that they substitute words left and right. They'll get most, and even not paying attention to the part of speech, right? Just saying adore instead of adorable. And either they notice that messes up the sentence, and so they start trying to change all the other words in the sentence to make it match, or they don't notice, and then the sentence is just word salad. So basically making them pay attention to all the parts of the word, and then thinking about morphology, right? How those word parts change the meaning of the word, is a really important focus in 3rd through 5th grade. And that helps them not only with decoding, but also with vocabulary. Those two things sort of merge into one. But also they need to be able to use context clues. Sure. The problem with that is that sometimes they're stronger than others. It just depends on the word, right? But really merging those two strategies, looking at all the word parts, thinking about the word parts, and then thinking about the context, what you can learn from the context, and making sure you're taking the time to slow down and do that when you're reading encountering new words and texts becomes really important in these upper grades, because they are encountering new vocabulary, and they can learn a lot of great vocabulary from reading if they have those strategies to slow down and pay attention.
I love this. I was having a conversation with one of my girls. She's 14 and she's a freshman in high school. And we were reading a sentence and the word was mediation. And as she read it, she said meditation. And so she was completely like, she wasn't thrown because she knows the word meditation. She knows what that means. But when we got to the comprehension question, she got it wrong because she misunderstood the text. And so we went back and I said, well, what is that word? And 3 times she said meditation. And finally I said to her, let's break this word down. I refuse to tell her the word because I need her to see all of the parts of the word. And I said, now do what we used to do when we were in first grade and break down the word, right? Break it down. And she went, oh, mediation. I said, do you see how just a simple seeing the word as a block, as opposed to seeing each part of the word can change the complete meaning of the word? And so everything you said was fantastic.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Those are very close, but you do have to pay attention to every letter in the word, or you get the wrong word, right? And it does really, it does throw off your comprehension of the text, and and it also helps paying attention to all the parts. Also, really helps you with your spelling, right? If she had to go write mediation, I bet she would be much better prepared to spell it correctly, having done that work with you, than if she had just sort of figured it out, but like not paid close attention and moved on in the text. So there's actually quite a bit of research about paying attention to all those spelling patterns, both for reading and for spelling.
You just so perfectly summed up the connection for our intermediate students between encoding, decoding, syllable work, morphology, context clues. Like, you just put everything together in an example. And so I hope our listeners appreciate that as much as Terry and I are here appreciating it.
Well, I think that is one of the challenges in the upper grades, is that especially in the younger grades, sometimes you have like a separate program for phonemic awareness and a separate program for phonics and a separate program for fluency and a separate program for vocabulary. Right. And it really, I'm not sure that I think that those could be better integrated at all grade levels, but particularly in the upper grade levels, it doesn't really make sense, right? Because the same words you're having trouble decoding are the same words you're having trouble spelling, which are the same new vocabulary words you need to be learning. And so all of these things really need to come together to support comprehension of what you're reading. And so it's like having separate times or programs or approaches for all those things is fine, but it does need to come together, and kids need to learn how to use all those skills simultaneously to make sense of a text.
Absolutely.
And then we start throwing in there all of these French words and Spanish words, and it's like all of it just comes together. And with that in mind, what do teachers need to be taught in order to be successful in the classroom? So
they need to be taught that, evidence-based practices for all of these things, for, fluency, for multisyllabic decoding, for vocabulary. But they also need practice supporting kids in reading. I think there's this idea that because these older kids can read silently and independently a lot of the time, that's what they should be doing all of the time, right? That we give them a book to read and they go off and read it, and then we come back and talk about it. But actually, teachers need to be listening to kids read at this age, especially pre-service teachers. I make them listen to kids read a lot, and intervening and being there to provide that helpful support when they come to a word they don't know, or need to go back and get some reread with some fluency support. So they need opportunities to actually listen to these kids read. Just because a kid can read silently doesn't mean that that's what they should be doing all the time in the classroom.
So every time we have our podcast, we always ask one specific question. And that question is, what are 2 things that leaders can do to accelerate reading achievement?
So the first thing that we can do is make sure that we have high quality word level instruction. I know that this is something that we've been talking about a ton during the science of reading, but making sure that teachers have the materials that they need to do that. Right. So not just telling them to teach phonics, but giving them high quality instructional materials and programs that they can work from so that they don't have to make up all their own phonics lessons, and making sure that there is time to do that every day throughout the grade level. So in the beginning levels, focusing on alphabet knowledge and beginning phonics instruction, but continuing that work, focusing on multisyllabic decoding and morphology as they go up through the upper grades. So that's one piece, but that piece is only good if they also have opportunities to practice using those skills in texts, high quality, culturally responsive texts that the kids find engaging throughout the day. And this doesn't mean independent reading time. This can be scaffolded reading time. This can be with fluency support. This can be to support a writing assignment, but just making sure that they have opportunities to apply what they're learning in their word level instruction in high quality text throughout the day for many different purposes. So I would say those are the two main things.
Thank you so much. We have just been truly overjoyed to have you. And I know that Terry and I have had our minds blown a little bit just with the way that you so succinctly are able to connect all of the facets of reading instruction in your examples. And so we just want to thank you so much for sharing that with us and sharing that with our listeners. And we hope to talk to you again soon.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Thanks for joining us. If you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. We will see you next time on Science of Reading Leadership, guiding minds, transforming lives.